Hello and welcome to the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Today we're sitting down with Jonathan Berkshire Miller. He's co-founder and principal at Pendulum Geopolitical Advisory, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he's also a member of the North American Advisory Board of this podcast's parent institution, the International House of Japan. And today we're going to talk about the Canadian election. So, Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's a real pleasure to be on, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk about Canada.
Likewise. So, for a guy who has been very concerned about foreign interference in his own elections, as he almost wastes no opportunity to remind us, Donald Trump seems to have had an absolutely outsized influence on the outcome of the Canadian elections in April, flipping the polls at least from, almost a certain conservative win to a solid liberal win. Is that fair to say? Did Donald Trump have that kind of an impact on the outcome of the elections, or is there other stuff in the background that we may not have noticed?
Well, it's a fascinating question. And again, thanks for that question to start things off. Understanding we're in a podcast here and I don't have visuals to sort of show this, but if you go back into the early months of this year, so just after Christmas and early January, and you would look at charts and graphs that would show probability. So polling aggregators that would take in all the different polls, whether they're conservative, whether they're liberal, left or right. There was a showing, as you mentioned there, Paul, that not only was it probable, basically almost certain of a conservative win, it was actually certain 99.9% of a conservative sweeping majority. So this is the interesting thing to kind of think about is that...
Sorry, can I just underline that first? 99.9% odds of a sweep.
A sweeping majority. So basically, when people, whether it was diplomats or other officials would talk to me, they were basically already making their sort of predictions and analysis about who would the ministers be, who would the advisors be. There was so much certainty and preparation on a lot of sides for a conservative government and a majority government. Two big things sort of changed this. And I think to your question, the Trump factor was a big one. The other really significant factor is some of this polling was done before Justin Trudeau, our former prime minister, had resigned. So there was a deep distaste, I think, after a while. Canadians, like a lot of other citizens, eventually tire of the incumbents, and Trudeau definitely was a clear example of this. So I think Trudeau's presence alone was a big factor in this. But the interesting point, and to sort of get to your question on Trump, is that even after Justin Trudeau had his resignation and there was a Liberal Party convention to elect Mark Carney as the next party leader, who eventually became the next prime minister, still the polling was very, very strongly in favor of a conservative majority. So this leads to the impact of Donald Trump and some of the things he's been saying about Canada becoming the 51st state. Of course, the threat of tariffs that became not only a threat but a reality for Canada. This really did swing the scales. Usually, foreign policy and security issues don't play into our election cycle, but the Canadian sort of patriotism and pride really got drummed up. And I think that there was a very clever play by the Liberal Party with a new sort of face, no longer the Justin Trudeau, which I mentioned before was deeply unpopular, to sort of play into this sense that maybe the Conservative Party is somewhat similar to what's happened down south. So I think without even having to be explicit on this, there was a lot of implicit sort of campaigning that really focused on this idea that, do we want to elect someone who potentially might share some values with Donald Trump? My last point of this is whether that was true or not, clearly that had an impact and a resonance with the Canadian voters, because what we saw on Election Day was not necessarily a majority for the Liberals, but a complete turnaround from a near certain conservative majority to actually the Liberals winning the election and almost winning a majority.
So My next question is going to be a two-part question before we get back to the Donald Trump factor. One, tell us a little bit about the win insofar as what it means for the stability of the Mark Carney government. You said they came in just short of a majority. And so tell our listeners, please, what that means for their future stability and what that might mean for, say, a potential rerun of elections in another year or two. And then second part, unless you want to tackle that first, but second part, tell us about the Mark Carney government. We know a little bit about Mark Carney, but what's their general outlook on the world around them? What are some of the key decision makers around Mark Carney? And just what's the personality of this government a little bit like? Just to compare to Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau was a big personality, or at least a big brand. You didn't necessarily know a lot about Canada, but you certainly recognized Justin Trudeau. Is there going to be that kind of factor again, or is it going to be something different?
So a great question. So let me try to be concise in the answer. So first of all, on the political scenario situation right now, it is a minority government, which always has challenges. That means that you have to have partners, whether they're official or unofficial. But this is a very strong minority government. So right now, under the Liberals, there's 170 seats. So they're two seats shy of a majority. In the previous government under Justin Trudeau, there was an informal sort of coalition or supply agreement with the NDP, which is our third party, which effectively got decimated in this election. And many of the votes basically went to the two sides. One side went to the Liberals, the other side went to the Conservatives. But the point is that, number one, the party will be a little bit constrained because it doesn't have an outright majority. But also, I think if they read the room on Canadians absolutely do not want another election anytime in the near future. So if you're the Conservatives right now, having squandered a 25 to 27 point lead in the polls, yes, you can take some rejoice in the fact that the Liberals don't have a majority, but you dare not, I think, at this point, try to force an election in a non-confidence vote. Even if you did have other coalition parties that could put you in that position, I don't think anytime soon, unless there's a very serious issue that puts this government in. So I think there's a fragile stability. It's not. He doesn't necessarily have that political stability with the majority, but there is a stability in the sense that Canadians have made their choice at this point, and I think have been pretty clear that they want some level of leadership, in particular with this time with the U.S. relationship. To the second part of your question is the sort of fingerprints or the forensics DNA of what this government might look like and how it might be different from the previous one. I think there's a lot of differences. So without sort of boring you about the history of Canadian politics, Mark Carney is sort of like from a party of the past. He's from a party that we used to call the Progressive Conservatives. Like he's a liberal now, but in many old conservatives would say he's basically kind of one of us. So if you think of like the Brian Mulroney mold and former progressive conservatives who sort of lean a little bit, sometimes center right, but are not further on the right spectrum. Mark Carney very much is of this mold. And interestingly enough, even though he has different sort of ideological bent on this, he actually has similarities to former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Both have an economist sort of background. Both are very serious folks. They're less about the sort of the style and the brand, as you mentioned, with Justin Trudeau and the ideology, which I think weared really thin on, especially when it came to the foreign policy formulation, and more on the substance and really efficiently moving forward. So I think this is one of the things you'll see is a bit more leanness, a bit more focus, a lot more of a technocratic approach rather than a sort of ideological approach is the way that I expect to see things happening. And, you've seen a few signs of this already with the cabinet formulation. He's put some folks into foreign affairs, into the defense portfolios who, while they're not new folks, they're perhaps a little bit more sober-minded and sort of realpolitik in their views necessarily more than the sort of ideological focus.
Okay, so with that baseline now in place, we know the stability of the government more or less. We know Mark Carney and his outlook and the general team he'll have in place. So, okay, let's start trying to figure out the inbox that's waiting for Mark Carney and his government in Ottawa. So first things first, I threatened to go back to this topic, Trump and the tariffs. So again, sort of a two-part question. How are tariffs so far impacting Canadians? Is this something, you're in Ottawa right now, so when you go to the store, for example, or just any Canadian when they go to the store, are there shortages? Are there higher prices? Is this something that you're seeing, day to day already? Second part is, how do you think Mark Carney is going to respond to this? We had the meeting between Carney and Trump in D.C. last week, couple weeks ago, whenever that was, and it seemed to be okay. They both sort of put down their lines and stuck to them, but there wasn't really any, tension or blow up or anything like that. So yes, the second two-part question, what's the impact of the tariffs and how is Mark Carney going to plan for it?
So I think great question. So, on the tariffs, I think the short answer is I think we're still waiting to suss this out a little bit. So sometimes the economic impact takes a couple quarters, but we have seen some of the impacts, which I think some of it can be ascribed to the tariffs already. We had some relatively grim unemployment figures coming out. I think our unemployment rate is rising close to 7% now. Not all of that can be ascribed to the tariffs. There's other challenges coming out of the public debt and the spending that came out of the pandemic. But definitely, I think there's some fallout impacts from the tariffs. As far as the sort of the every man or every woman sort of impact, going to the grocery store, filling up gas and everything else, it hasn't been noticed so much. But I think some of the things that actually are really interesting is international travel flows. So I was in Washington last week, actually the same time Mark Carney was there. It was eerie to see how few Canadians are actually traveling to the United States. And I'd read the news stories, I'd seen all the TV clips on it, but there was nobody in the security line. And I take those flights quite a bit, and to see how stark it was, how many Canadians have really adapted their travel plans. There's a lot of dual citizens. There's a lot of folks who own properties. The amount of folks that are either selling off their winter homes in Florida, opting for different vacations. I think this has a significant impact probably on the U.S. economy, in addition to, of course, some of the factors in the Canadian economy. So that's one thing that I've noticed a bit more viscerally. I've noticed a number of Canadians are making, some of them are not as serious on this, but are making different choices when it comes to shopping and trying to be a little bit more careful about buying Canadian and things like that. So those are some of the sort of immediate issues I see. On the second part of the question is how is Mark Carney dealing with this? I would give him probably like a B+ in his meeting with Trump. I thought it was he survived, and fortunately or unfortunately, that's the sort of barometer that
that's the bar that we've been facing, hasn't it?
It is. It's unfortunate that we've gotten to this point that you have to get in and out of the Oval Office alive, but that's basically where what most Canadians, we were all anxious, regardless of your politics, for the country to see how he performed and see if our national pride got hurt by the meeting. There's this sort of verb now that's to be Zelensky'd, and I think and no leader wants to be in the position where unfortunately Volodymyr Zelensky was from Ukraine with the unfortunate Oval Office meeting. So I think he did okay to sort of get out of there alive, and I think that was pretty much the expectations were quite low. I think they were to set a baseline, to have a first meeting. And to contextualize this, I think that their next in-person meeting will be at G7, which is hosted by Canada this year in Alberta. And it was really important for Mark Carney to, for the stability of that meeting, to have any sense of a decent meeting. He wants to get the first Trump meeting done for before that. And know that G7 is not going to be hinged on, how does the first engagement with Donald Trump go? So I think that was really important for Mark Carney. And one sort of final point on this is that I think the pre-election dialogue and rhetoric in Canada on the relationship versus the post-election one is different. We have our politics too. And as I said, it was very helpful for Mark Carney and the Liberal Party to perhaps even play this up or torque this up even more than it should have been torqued up for their own benefit. And I think now is the time for him, not to retrench, but to realize that we still need to live with the U.S. It's still our largest trade and security partner. So I think you're going to see a little bit more pragmatism and a little bit less rhetoric going forward.
Okay, so before we unpack that a little bit, I just want to do a quick sidebar and ask you where you think this whole 51st state business came from. Because my strong hunch, I mean, I don't have any insider information into all of this. I've heard rumors here and there. A lot of it to me just seemed like Trump had a personal dislike of Justin Trudeau. Again, I don't know if that's where it all came from, but the tone of Trump seems to have changed from something that was, sort of antagonistic, jocular, almost bullying regarding Justin Trudeau to something more cordial, conventional with Mark Carney. So that's kind of why my hunch is that it was kind of like Trump wanted to antagonize Justin and he found a way to do that. What's your theory? What's your hunch of where this 51st state business came from?
I think you're onto something there. So there's a lot of different elements there. And, I find it's interesting to think of the different camps around Trump on this, because I think a lot of them are deeply ideological when it comes to politics. And I think their preference for, they're quite open about it, and they've been open about it on social media, was to support, of course, a conservative government that would be more aligned with their some of their beliefs, even though, sometimes I think they misinterpreted the Conservative Party of Canada and how, deep of a conservative Pierre Poilievre was. But there was a deep preference from them to find ways to strengthen him ahead of the election. But Donald Trump, as we know, is deeply unpredictable. In many ways, he's very personal. His politics are very personal. So to your point about the 51st state thing, I think that he does not forget many things, and definitely does not forget what he feels are personal insults. I mean, you remember some of the multilateral settings where Justin Trudeau was caught on camera sort of making snide remarks and jokes about Trump and what a fool he is, and laughing with European leaders about this. Trump I don't think he forgot any of these things. And when Justin Trudeau, after the election, kind of came down to Mar-a-Lago and felt that he was going to all of a sudden change the tune and be the strong Canadian leader, I think Trump almost enjoyed this idea of sort of like stringing him along and calling him governor afterwards. So the story goes, at least what many U.S. officials around Trump say, is that when he started talking about the tariffs, and Justin Trudeau retorted that, look, if you put these levels of tariffs on Canadians, like we won't even be able to exist anymore. And then Donald Trump quipped, well, why don't you become the 51st state? And he's the gaslighter in chief. So whenever something resonates and he realizes that it sort of gets under your skin, he just kept on using it. So, I actually don't think there's any grand strategy behind this, rather than, as you mentioned, really having a deep distaste for our former prime minister, and frankly, not to the interest of the United States here, because I think a conservative government, it wouldn't have been perfect if this sort of episode did not happen. And there still would be issues on defense spending and things that they would have called Canada probably rightly to task on. It would have been completely different, but I think he just could not resist his temptation to be the sort of the nail in the coffin of Justin Trudeau's political career.
So the final question on U.S.-Canada for now. What do you think the odds are that Canada and the United States will reach some kind of agreement like what we've seen with the United States and UK, or the United States and China, regardless of what you think the details might be? And if you want to weigh in on what you think the details might be, have at it. But we do have this deadline of 90 deals in 90 days. The deadline, if we stick to that calendar, would be July 8th. Right now, we are 2 deals down, 88 to go. So what do you think the odds are of Canada being one of those countries with whom the United States can reach an agreement? And what do you think the broad contours of that would look like?
Well, I think it's interesting. So I think there's incentives to find ways, of course, from the Canadian side, and I imagine from the U.S. side, to relieve some of the tariffs. Is the ironic thing about this, and you've seen this with some of the pragmatic deals that he's been trying to strike with China, that, I mean, he's realized that he's sort of gone over his skis on certain things, and rather than actually framing trade deals, he's sort of finding ways to basically retrench or pull back on some of his reciprocal tariffs. So I feel like there is probably a sense from both sides to find ways to move back. The challenge, though, in the Canadian context, which is a little bit different from some other ones, even from a Japanese context, as an example, is that with the trade agreement that we have, that ironically Donald Trump negotiated himself, renegotiated, which is the USMCA, or what we call CUSMA, that is the backbone that I think Canada still is framing its sort of negotiating stance on. So we're still under the impression, and we get this from some of the Trump principals like Lipnick and others, that this might be setting the stage for a CUSMA renegotiation. And if that's the case, that's a discussion that we have to have. We're not happy that we're forced to do it before the actual review period, but that's something that we're happy to entertain and gird ourselves for those negotiations. What I think the Canadian side would feel less incentivized to do is just sort of feel like the gun to the head, let's make quick side deals on this. It makes sense for countries that don't have those frameworks, but for ones that already have like codified deals like CUSMA, I think it's a bit more tricky, because then the questions for the trade negotiators on our side will be like, well, what's the purpose of having a trade deal if we're just sort of making backroom deals and he's able to change the game at a whim? So I think I do think that it's going to be a bit trickier for Canada. I also think we're going to look very carefully at the content of some of these deals. So I haven't looked with granular detail at the UK deal, but for some folks have said, look, it's not really a trade deal. I mean, it's basically elements that address certain things, and both sides can kind of walk off with some level of self-respect. China is the exact same thing. It's not a trade deal. I mean, it's basically both sides saying, okay, we're going to give in on this, but we still have our protectionism on this. So I think we're going to kind of try to wait this out a little bit, even though it's going to be extremely painful, and try to secure the best long-term deal.
So, you mentioned give a nod to Canada and call it CUSMA. How confident were Canadians, say, before January, before Inauguration Day, how confident were Canadians in the possibility of CUSMA being successfully renegotiated? And now post-January, post-February, post-March 1st tariffs, how confident would you say Canadians are in a successful renegotiation of CUSMA? Because before, my own sense, talking to at least the American side, is that this is one of those things that Donald Trump was going to try to do. We know it's up for renegotiation 2026, but don't worry about it. It'll be fine. What's Canada's take on this?
Well, I think it's really interesting. So I think, I can't blame officials for thinking this, because probabilities might have pushed them in this direction. But if you think,
it is a legally binding agreement.
It is.
After all. So I don't really blame them for having confidence in the fact that it would hang around. But ...
Exactly. No, it's a very fair question. And I think, so if we even go back a little bit before the election, so just like in the months before the election, especially even the year before the election, and then intertwine it with our own politics. So if you think about the different scenarios, the CAN-US scenarios that could have been there, and even the probable scenarios, I think we were girding ourselves. We weren't predicting necessarily Trump coming back, but we absolutely were preparing for that being a really distinct possibility, even after, Biden stepped down and, the Kamala Harris effect was coming, and there was a lot of predictions that, she may actually take the Oval. I think we were not to say we didn't believe it, but we were very prepared for both possible outcomes in the U.S. I think where we were a little bit less prepared was actually on our own politics. I think, good bureaucrats prepare for anything, but I think there was a sense around town generally that the Conservatives would come in. And why that matters for the U.S. angle and CUSMA and everything else is I think there was a sense that, look, if the Conservatives come in and it is a Democratic administration, then maybe we won't have to deal with all of the challenge of tariffs and everything else. We'll have other conversations. If it's a Trump administration, maybe it's a good thing that we have a Conservative administration. Maybe they'll be nicer to us. Maybe the wounds of the past with Trudeau will be solved. Maybe there will be some sort of meeting of the minds. So I feel like it's not that they dismissed the idea of CUSMA being a problem, but I think there was a lot of optimism, and that was the trajectory that we were facing. Those two scenarios, either a Poilievre-Harris or a Poilievre-Trump scenario. What I think they didn't envision, correctly, they didn't envision a Trudeau-Trump in the long term. But what they probably didn't envision was somebody like a Mark Carney taking over and having to deal with a Trump administration. So I think that has changed the game a lot. And I'd say too, I mean, we haven't really got into the defense spending part of it too, but this has also been something that we've been neglecting for a long time, has been a slow burn for both sides of the aisle in the US. And something we probably could have put a lot more preparation in, because tariffs are the lead sort of issue that everyone's focusing on. Fentanyl is being kind of thrown around too. But I think reliability generally on security is absolutely a sort of an underbelly of a lot of this discussion in Washington. I mean, Canada's at about 1.3 to 1.4% spending of GDP. It's just, with everything going on, it's not acceptable. And I think Trump is using that as another sort of line to critique us on.
So that actually tees me up well for my next question, because I know you've written a lot on the need for Canada to have a more comprehensive national security strategy. I think you had a report this year on this very topic. So I do definitely want to get your thoughts on this, because, this is sort of where we'll turn away from, a US focused conversation and sort of think about Canada more broadly, because at least the way I'm imagining it, thinking about it, there's going to have to be somewhat of a diversification in Canada's economic relationships, security relationships, whether that's for the better or worse. I'll leave up to our listeners and the experts and whatnot. But there is a real opportunity here for Canada to sort of develop a more global strategy, I think. What are your thoughts on all this as Canada prepares for a new relationship with the United States? What doors does that, potentially open, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think there's a few different angles on it. I mean, first, I'm all for diversification, and I think that there's ways that we should have been engaging, probably could be doing more things, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's in Europe. But before even getting to that point, I think we do have to ground ourselves in reality. And I hate to sort of throw cold water on it before even starting, but I think a lot of Canadians are caught up in this moment in time right now where they're, pumping, their chest and saying, okay, look, the U.S. has become a big problem. We'll just go to Brussels and we'll go to Tokyo and Seoul and that'll solve everything. It won't. Spoiler alert. We are a North American nation. Our geography does still matter. 70% of our trades with the U.S., all of our security infrastructure, Five Eyes, NATO, et cetera, defense production is linked in with the U.S. It doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't do more ourselves and with others. But I want to start with the sort of caveat that the idea of hedging off or decoupling is just absurd to me. I think it's not feasible. And I often even say with other U.S. allies, like Japan's an example, or Germany or France, is Canada's strategic choices are different than theirs. I mean, we all share a lot. We all have the U.S. as an ally, but we are right next to the U.S. Like Germany can talk and actually do things, even if it's to their detriment, that may disconnect it more from the U.S. Like we don't have that luxury. We have the Arctic where we have Russia, now China at play there too. Like we do have a necessity to have a productive, stable relationship with the U.S. So that's the first sort of part. That being said, I do think the diversification thing is something we should be thinking more. I think Europe is one sort of positive angle. I think it's a good moment in time to do more with them. I do think that the growth areas really are in the Indo-Pacific. We've released the strategy for the region. Japan and Korea are sort of the areas that are the easiest parts and the most productive parts of that strategy so far. But to throw a little bit more cold water on this is that as much as I love Japan and Korea, that also will not be sufficient. And we need to be thinking about some of the growth economies in Southeast Asia and also India, which is a very complicated relationship for Canada now and probably could be the subject of another podcast. But it's the idea of us having a successful diversification strategy with a fractured relationship with Russia, China, India, and the United States it's sort of a fantasy. I mean, we need to find a way to have a balance, in particular with the United States and India. I mean, I feel that Russia and China, we need to mitigate, they're largely adversaries, and we need to mitigate the risks. But I think the idea that we can have bad relations with four great powers and still be economically successful is really challenging. So I'd say that's the way that we should be thinking of diversification is do it, but manage your expectations.
Okay. I think that's a good note to end on. Jonathan Berkshire Miller, thanks a lot for joining us. I personally am a big fan of making sure that Canada stays, in people's minds as an Indo-Pacific country and as, an important player in world affairs. So I look forward to having more conversations on these topics as we go forward. Maybe, during I just gave you a nod to the name and now I completely forgot the name. The CAMSA? CANSA.
The CANSEC?
CANSEC. In my country, we call it the USMCA.
Oh, CUSMA, yeah.
CUSMA,
yes, yeah. We're terrible with acronyms. We created the CPTPP too, which is another terrible acronym.
Yeah, that one, every time I have to write that down, I sort of, spare a thought for Justin Trudeau, and it's not a nice one. But be that as it may, thanks so much again for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Finally, life never gave us lemons. We invented them for ourselves. Lemons aren't naturally occurring, but are the hybrid of the bitter orange and citron fruits. It's believed that the lemon was developed in northern India around 2,000 years ago, and there's a painting of a woman holding a lemon in the 15th century BCE tomb of Nakhd in ancient Egypt, providing a hint of its age and its spread across the ancient world. The bitter orange itself is a hybrid of the mandarin and the pomelo, both of which are native to Southeast Asia, as is the citron, which also appears in ancient art in modern Iran and the Mediterranean, and was a fancy status symbol in ancient Rome, so much so that it gave its name to the entire genus of these fruits, as well as to citric acid. Lemon's exclusivity led to the import of the more affordable limes, oranges, and pomelos to meet demand while also maintaining the lemon status, which was prized for its medicinal qualities as well as for its fragrance, taste, and as an ornamental plant for their gardens. It was one of the first Old World plants that were brought to the New World, as Christopher Columbus brought lemon seeds with him on a visit to Hispaniola in 1493, again, primarily for medicine and ornamentation. The medicinal aspects would have been particularly important for a sailor like Columbus, as the citric acid in lemons was a vital source of vitamin C that prevents against scurvy, which is possibly fatal. It can also, of course, be used for lemonade. Just understand that it's not life that gave us lemons, it's us. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show, so send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.